The morning of December 1st, 1864, dawned cold and brutal over the bloodied fields of Franklin, Tennessee. A pale winter sun struggled through frost-laden clouds, casting its dim light across a landscape transformed into a tableau of death. Where hours before thousands of Confederate soldiers had charged with desperate courage, now only silence remained, broken occasionally by the distant rush of the Harpeth River and the mournful calls of crows circling overhead. The ground was carpeted with fallen men, their gray uniforms stained crimson, their weapons scattered like broken toys across the frozen earth. This was the aftermath of one of the bloodiest assaults of the entire American Civil War, a catastrophic defeat that would set the stage for an even greater disaster. The Battle of Franklin had been Lieutenant General John Bell Hood's desperate gamble to salvage his ambitious invasion of Tennessee. With 39,000 rebel soldiers under his command, Hood had crossed the Tennessee River with audacious dreams of liberating Nashville from Union occupation and pushing northward through Kentucky to plant the Confederate flag on the banks of the Ohio River itself. But his plan required destroying two separate Union armies before they could unite. When he finally cornered Major General John Schofield's army at Franklin, Hood found them strongly entrenched behind formidable earthworks. Rather than wait or maneuver, the aggressive Confederate commander ordered a frontal assault across 2 miles of open ground with minimal artillery support, sending his men into a maelstrom of fire and death. The result at Franklin was nothing short of catastrophic for the Confederacy. In 5 brutal hours of fighting, Hood's army lost 6,200 men killed or wounded, including 55 regimental officers and 12 generals. It was one of the most devastating Southern defeats of the war, a slaughter that left the Army of Tennessee reeling and broken. Yet somehow, incredibly, Hood was not deterred. As weary Confederate soldiers spent December 1st burying their fallen comrades in mass graves, their commander was already planning his next move. Despite the staggering losses, despite the shattered morale, despite every rational argument against continuing, Hood decided to press onward toward Nashville. It was a decision that would lead to the final destruction of his army. Meanwhile, Major General Schofield had slipped away from Franklin under cover of darkness, marching his battered but victorious troops northward through the freezing December night. On December 1st, his army reached Nashville and linked up with Major General George Thomas's forces, bringing the total Union strength in the city to approximately 55,000 men. Nashville had been under Union occupation since February 1862, and in the intervening years, Federal engineers had transformed it into a fortress. A 7-mile-long semicircle of fortifications protected the southern and western approaches to the city, studded with artillery batteries, trenches, and earthworks. The mighty Cumberland River guarded the northern and eastern flanks. It was an almost impregnable defensive position, and Hood's weakened, demoralized army was marching straight toward it. The Confederate commander who led his broken army toward this fortress was a complex and tragic figure. John Bell Hood had earned his reputation as a fierce, aggressive fighter earlier in the war, leading bold attacks that won him promotion after promotion. But those same qualities, courage bordering on recklessness and aggression untempered by caution, would now prove his undoing. Hood had lost the use of his left arm at Gettysburg and his right leg at Chickamauga, wounds that left him in constant pain and dependent on laudanum for relief. Yet he remained in command, strapped to his saddle, driven by pride and desperation to achieve the impossible. For Hood understood a terrible truth. If he retreated from Tennessee now, his demoralized soldiers would simply desert and melt away into the hills. He had to attack no matter the odds. Hood arrived outside Nashville on December 2nd and quickly realized that storming the Union fortifications would be suicide. Instead, he adopted a different strategy, one born more of desperation than military wisdom. He would establish his own defensive line south of the city and wait, hoping to goad the cautious Union commander into attacking him. Hood's soldiers, many still nursing wounds from Franklin, began digging trenches and building earthworks in the frozen ground. They created a 4-mile-long defensive line anchored by 5 redoubts on the left flank, each garrison with 4 cannons and 150 men. As the rebels dug into the Tennessee soil, they must have wondered what madness had brought them here, outnumbered more than 2 to 1, waiting for an enemy who held every advantage to come and destroy them. Facing Hood across those frozen fields was George Henry Thomas, a Virginian who had chosen loyalty to the Union over loyalty to his native state when the war began. Thomas had built an impressive reputation as one of the Union's most steadfast commanders, earning the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga for his ability to hold defensive positions against overwhelming odds. He was methodical, careful, and thorough, qualities that made him an excellent defensive general but sometimes frustrated his superiors who wanted faster, more aggressive action. Now in command of 55,000 troops, with Hood's weakened army practically begging to be destroyed, Thomas found himself under enormous pressure from Washington to attack immediately. But the burly Virginian refused to be rushed. He would attack when he was ready and not before. Thomas's delays infuriated his superiors in Washington, particularly General-in-Chief Ulysses Grant, who fired off increasingly impatient telegrams demanding action. Thomas offered reasonable excuses. Ice storms had made the ground treacherous, sub-freezing temperatures had immobilized his cavalry horses, he needed more time to concentrate his forces properly. All these reasons were valid, but they failed to satisfy Grant, who feared the opportunity to destroy Hood's army was slipping away with each passing day. Meanwhile, Hood's position grew more desperate. He sent his cavalry commander, the notorious Nathan Bedford Forrest, to raid the railway line to Murfreesboro, hoping to draw Thomas out of his fortifications. The raid accomplished little except tearing up a few miles of track, and Thomas remained stubbornly inside Nashville, preparing for an attack in his own time. December 8th brought a bitter ice storm that coated the trenches and fortifications in a layer of frozen misery. Confederate soldiers, many without adequate winter clothing, shivered in their earthworks as temperatures plummeted below freezing. Some of the wounded from Franklin, their bodies weakened by injury, succumbed to the brutal cold. Others huddled together for warmth, their rifles frosted over, their fingers too numb to pull triggers effectively. Day after agonizing day passed with no Union attack. The rebels waited, growing weaker, colder, more desperate. Finally, on the evening of December 14th, Thomas gathered his corps commanders and laid out his battle plan. He would launch a diversionary attack against Hood's right flank while sending his main force against the Confederate left. The assault would begin the next morning. After 2 weeks of waiting, the battle for Nashville was about to begin. The early morning fog still clung to the frozen ground when Thomas launched the first phase of his attack at 8 o'clock on the morning of December 15th. 2 Union brigades under Major General James Steedman advanced along the Murfreesboro Pike toward the Confederate right flank. One brigade consisted primarily of African American soldiers of the United States colored troops fighting to prove their worth and courage. The other was made up of what their colonel described as new conscripts, convalescents, and bounty jumpers, men whose dedication to the Union cause was questionable. As these soldiers approached the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, Confederate troops and a hidden 4-gun battery opened fire with devastating effect. Musket balls and canister shot tore through the advancing Union lines, mowing down men in blue and sending the survivors reeling backward in disarray. But Steedman's troops refused to quit. Despite the withering fire, despite taking heavy casualties, despite many of them experiencing combat for the first time, these Union soldiers reformed their lines and charged again. For 2 brutal hours, they hammered at the Confederate right flank in a series of desperate assaults. Each attack was beaten back with heavy losses, but each time the survivors rallied and came again. Although Steedman's attack failed in its stated purpose of breaking through the rebel lines, it succeeded brilliantly in its true objective, holding the attention of Hood's soldiers and preventing them from reinforcing other parts of the line. While the Confederates focused on this ferocious assault on their right, Thomas was preparing to unleash the full fury of his army against their vulnerable left flank. The main Union assault against the Confederate left flank did not begin until around noon, but when it did, it was a sight of terrible magnificence. 3 full infantry corps and 1 cavalry corps, nearly 50,000 men in blue, began advancing across the frost-covered Tennessee countryside toward Hood's entrenched positions. Major General Thomas Wood, commanding the Union 4th Corps, would later write with pride about the spectacle. Far as the eye could reach, he recalled, lines and masses of blue moved forward in perfect order, the national emblem flaunting proudly above them. It was the largest concentrated assault of the entire Nashville campaign, a massive wave of Union soldiers sweeping forward like an unstoppable tide. The Confederate defenders, watching this immense force approach, must have felt a cold dread settling into their hearts. The Union troops swept up the hillsides toward the 5 Confederate redoubts that anchored Hood's left flank. Redoubt number 4, defended by a determined company of Alabama troops, put up fierce resistance. These rebels fought with desperate courage, holding out against 16 Federal regiments for over an hour. But courage alone could not stop the tide. Eventually, blue-coated Union soldiers poured through gaps between the cannons, their bayonets flashing in the afternoon sun. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted inside the redoubt as Union and Confederate soldiers grappled among the guns. Redoubt number 5 fell shortly thereafter, then Redoubt number 3. In the struggle for number 3, Colonel Sylvester Hill was killed by artillery fire, becoming the highest-ranking Union officer to die in the battle. By sunset, all 5 Confederate redoubts had been stormed and captured, leaving Hood's left flank completely untenable. As darkness fell on December 15th, Hood faced a grim reality. His left flank had collapsed, and his army could not hold its current position another day. Rather than risk total destruction, the Confederate commander made the painful decision to withdraw 2 miles further south, establishing a new, tighter defensive line. This new position was anchored by 2 hills, Peach Orchard Hill on the right and Compton's Hill on the left. Hood stationed Lieutenant General Stephen Lee's corps on the right at Peach Orchard Hill. These troops had seen minimal fighting at Franklin and little action today, so they remained relatively fresh and numerous. The center would be held by Lieutenant General Alexander Stewart's battered corps, while Major General Benjamin Cheatham's corps, still reeling from its catastrophic losses at Franklin, would defend the left at Compton's Hill. It was a desperate gamble, but Hood had no other choice. As his exhausted soldiers dug new trenches in the frozen ground, they prepared for the attack they knew would come with the dawn. Dawn on December 16th found the Union Army scattered and disorganized, most units still positioned where they had ended the previous day's fighting. Thomas ordered them forward into new attack positions, but the movement took hours. Union soldiers groggily stumbled through the cold morning, reforming their lines, checking their weapons, preparing for another day of battle. It was not until noon that Thomas's forces were finally ready to strike. The battle began, once again, on the Confederate right flank at Peach Orchard Hill. 2 of Steedman's brigades and 2 of Wood's brigades surged up the muddy slope into a storm of rebel artillery fire. These troops had orders to vigorously press and unceasingly harass the enemy, to look for any weakness that could be exploited. Between noon and 3 in the afternoon, they made repeated assaults up that blood-soaked hillside, taking devastating casualties from Confederate cannons firing canister shot at point-blank range. The assault on Peach Orchard Hill was brutal beyond description. The 13th United States Colored Infantry Regiment lost 221 casualties, approximately 40% of its entire fighting strength. After one particularly savage repulse, Union soldiers, both white and black, lay wounded and dying near the enemy works at the outer edge of the abattis, too close to retreat but unable to advance. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. This ferocious attack on the Confederate right had the exact effect Thomas intended. Hood, fearing his right flank would break under the relentless pressure, ordered 2 of Cheatham's divisions to reinforce Lee's position. This decision stripped men from the already undermanned Confederate left at Compton's Hill, spreading Hood's defensive line dangerously thin. The stage was set for the decisive blow that would end the battle and destroy the Army of Tennessee. With the Confederate cavalry under Brigadier General James Wilson threatening Hood's left and rear, this was the perfect moment for Thomas to launch his main assault against Compton's Hill. But Major General Schofield, commanding the Union Corps assigned to make the attack, hesitated. He falsely believed he was outnumbered and in danger of being flanked, and he wasted precious hours begging for reinforcements that he did not need. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, it seemed the main Union assault might never occur at all. It was at this critical juncture that Brigadier General John MacArthur decided to take matters into his own hands. The 38-year-old Scottish-born Chicagoan realized that the Confederates on Compton's Hill had been weakened and spread too thin. At 3:30 in the afternoon, MacArthur sent a note to Thomas. Unless ordered otherwise, he was attacking in 5 minutes. When no countermand arrived, MacArthur gave the signal, and his 3 brigades began moving uphill toward glory. By the time MacArthur's troops reached Compton's Hill, the Confederate defenses had been severely damaged by hours of Union artillery bombardment. An icy rain had begun at midday and continued falling, drenching the rebel defenders to the bone as they huddled in their battered trenches. Chetham's soldiers were exhausted, cold, hungry, and demoralized, their numbers dangerously depleted by Hood's decision to reinforce the right flank. This was their condition when MacArthur's brigades crested the hill. The 1st Brigade to reach the top drew the concentrated fire of the Confederate defenders, but this sacrifice freed the other 2 brigades to slam into the unsuspecting rebel line from different directions. In almost an instant, the Confederate left flank crumbled beneath the weight of the assault. Like dominoes, the tattered rebel brigades collapsed one after another, their soldiers throwing down their muskets and fleeing down the reverse slope. Colonel William Shy, the 25-year-old commander of the 20th Tennessee Regiment, made a desperate attempt to rally his fleeing men atop the hill. Standing alone with his sword raised, he shouted orders and encouragement, trying to stem the tide of panic. But a Union bullet found him, and Colonel Shy fell dead, one of the last Confederate officers to die in defense of the position. From that day forward, Compton's Hill would be known as Shy's Hill in honor of his sacrifice. Meanwhile, the panic that had begun on the Confederate left spread like wildfire across the entire rebel line. Within minutes, Hood's whole army was in full retreat, soldiers abandoning their positions and fleeing southward in complete disorder. Some Confederate officers tried desperately to stop this flood of terrified men, but as one eyewitness later wrote, they might as well have tried to stop the current of the Duck River with a fishing net. Thus the 2-day Battle of Nashville came to its devastating conclusion. For the Union, it was a decisive and complete victory. Thomas had lost approximately 3,000 men killed or wounded over the 2 days of fighting, a relatively modest price for such a comprehensive triumph. The Confederate losses were far more severe, approximately 6,000 casualties, including thousands captured. More importantly, Hood's army had been shattered psychologically as well as physically. Thomas was ecstatic, watching his soldiers roll the last Confederate resistance off Compton's Hill. He lifted his saber in the gathering dusk and cried out words that would be remembered. "Oh, what a grand army I have. God bless each member of it." His soldiers, exhausted but triumphant, cheered their commander as darkness fell over the battlefield. They had won not just a battle, but effectively ended the war in the Western theater. The atmosphere in the Confederate army stood in stark contrast to the Union jubilation. Under cover of darkness and cold black rain, the remnants of Hood's once-proud Army of Tennessee continued their disorderly retreat southward. The roads were choked with defeated soldiers, their faces hollow with exhaustion and despair. Many simply wandered away from their units, heading for home. That night, General Hood established his headquarters along the Franklin Pike, and there the broken Confederate commander finally confronted the magnitude of his disaster. A Tennessee private who witnessed the scene would never forget it. Hood was much agitated and affected, the soldier recalled, pulling his hair with his one good hand and crying like his heart would break. It was the image of a man who had gambled everything on an impossible dream and lost not just a battle, but an entire army. On December 17th, the shattered Confederate Army of Tennessee continued its painful retreat through the frozen Tennessee countryside. Thomas sent his cavalry in pursuit, though he knew the rebel army was already effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Hood managed to link back up with Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry, whose troopers provided a rearguard screen that allowed the infantry to cross the Duck River without being completely annihilated. The pursuit continued for days through bitter winter weather. Confederate soldiers abandoned equipment, weapons, and supplies along the roads as they struggled southward. Many simply could not continue and sat down by the roadside to await capture. On Christmas Day, 1864, what remained of Hood's army finally crossed back into Alabama, officially ending the disastrous Tennessee campaign. The soldiers who made it that far must have considered survival itself a Christmas miracle. The statistics of Hood's Tennessee campaign tell a story of almost unimaginable disaster. Of the nearly 40,000 Confederate soldiers who had crossed into Tennessee in late November with dreams of victory, fewer than 20,000 marched back out. The rest were killed, wounded, captured, or simply deserted. The Army of Tennessee had effectively ceased to exist as a viable fighting force. The survivors would eventually withdraw all the way to Tupelo, Mississippi, where on January 13, 1865, Hood would formally resign his command. He was replaced by General Joseph Johnston, but by then there was little left to command. The army that had once been one of the Confederacy's premier fighting forces, that had battled at Shiloh and Perryville and Chickamauga, had been destroyed in the frozen fields outside Nashville. The Battle of Nashville marked a turning point not just in the Western theater but in the entire Civil War. With the Army of Tennessee destroyed, the Confederacy lost its last significant military force west of the Appalachian Mountains. The war in the West was effectively over. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who had captured Atlanta in September and would soon begin his march to the sea, no longer needed to worry about Confederate forces threatening his supply lines or rear areas. The Union could now concentrate all its military might on the final campaigns in Virginia. Nashville also demonstrated the effectiveness of African American soldiers in combat, with the United States colored troops fighting with distinction and courage throughout both days of battle. Their performance helped advance the cause of racial equality and proved that black soldiers could fight as well as any white soldiers when given the opportunity. Nashville also represented one of the last major battles of the entire American Civil War. Within 4 months, the Confederate capital of Richmond would fall to Union forces. A few days after that, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee would surrender the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the war. Other Confederate forces would surrender in the following weeks, including Joseph Johnston's army in North Carolina. The Battle of Nashville, therefore, marked the beginning of the end, the moment when the Confederacy's last desperate gamble failed and the inevitability of Union victory became clear to all. It was, in the words of one historian, the battle that closed the door on Confederate hopes in the West and opened the path to final Union triumph. The legacy of the Battle of Nashville extends far beyond the immediate military consequences. For the city of Nashville itself, the battle secured its position as a major Union stronghold and allowed it to continue developing as an important manufacturing and supply center. The city would emerge from the war as one of the South's most important cities, its infrastructure intact and its economy relatively strong. For the soldiers who fought there, particularly the African American troops who proved their valor on the battlefield, Nashville represented a moment of pride and achievement that would be remembered for generations. The battle demonstrated that determination, superior numbers, and good leadership could overcome even the most desperate enemy resistance. It showed that the Union cause, despite setbacks and difficulties, would ultimately prevail through the courage and sacrifice of its soldiers. For John Bell Hood, Nashville was the end of his military career and, in many ways, the end of his life as he had known it. After resigning his command in January 1865, he would never hold another significant position. He spent the remaining years of his life trying to defend his decisions and restore his reputation, writing memoirs that blamed others for his failures. He died in 1879 during a yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans, taking his version of events with him. For George Thomas, Nashville was his greatest triumph, the victory that cemented his reputation as one of the Union's finest generals. Yet he would always remain somewhat in the shadow of more aggressive commanders like Grant and Sherman, his careful, methodical approach less celebrated than their bold campaigns. Nevertheless, Thomas's victory at Nashville demonstrated that sometimes patience and preparation could be just as effective as audacious aggression. The battlefield itself would gradually return to farmland and forest, the scars of combat slowly healing over time. Shies Hill would remain as a memorial to the young colonel who died defending it, a reminder of courage in a lost cause. The earthworks and fortifications would gradually erode, though traces can still be found today for those who know where to look. Veterans from both sides would occasionally return to the battlefield in later years, old men remembering the days when they were young and fought for causes they believed in. They would walk the ground where they had charged and bled and watch their friends die, and they would try to make sense of it all. The Battle of Nashville, like the Civil War itself, would become part of American memory, a chapter in the national story that continues to resonate and teach lessons about courage, sacrifice, leadership, and the terrible cost of armed conflict. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible historical journeys. We bring you the stories of the past with cinematic detail and historical accuracy. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next adventure through history. See you in the next one.